They said, "Your mom's house is wasted on her." And they didn't know I was standing just around the corner, holding a rag still damp from polishing the picture frames they never looked at. My son's voice was low, the kind of low that means he thinks he's being reasonable, that he's protecting someone from something unpleasant. His wife's voice was smooth, decisive, every word sharpened like a knife that's been waiting too long to be used. She doesn't even notice the paint peeling on the porch. She won't fix the roof. She sits there all day with the curtains half drawn. It's depressing, Dan. That house could be beautiful again. I froze where I was, in my own hallway, the smell of lemon polish thick in the air. The photographs on the wall stared back at me. My wedding day, my son in his first school uniform, the dog we buried under the oak tree 20 years ago. I had been cleaning those frames for decades. I thought I was preserving memories. Turns out I was dusting the past for people who'd already left it behind. I didn't move until I heard the sound of glasses clinking, the soft hum of their conversation blending with the television in the next room. The house had always carried sound like a secret. You can whisper in the kitchen and hear it in the attic. I used to love that when Derek was alive. It made the place feel alive, like every corner was listening. But that day, the walls just listened to betrayal. When I finally turned around, my reflection in the glass cabinet looked older than I remembered. 76 years old, a widow for 12, retired nurse, mother of one son who now looked at me like a puzzle missing too many pieces. I've lived in this house since 1974. It's seen me through the birth of a child, the death of a husband, the slow crumbling of certainty. But that afternoon, it felt foreign, like I'd been trespassing for years without noticing. I went back to the kitchen quietly, set down the rag, and poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd brewed 2 hours before. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. Through the window, the garden was still wild with late roses, the same ones Derek planted from cuttings he'd stolen from his mother's yard. I should have trimmed them last week, but I liked how they sprawled over the fence, disobedient and alive. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, hated them. She said they made the house look unkempt. That was her word, unkempt. As if life should always fit inside a catalog photo. She preferred order, matching curtains, minimalist decor, neutral tones. She had a way of making everything sound like an improvement, even when it was erasure. They were in the living room now, laughing softly, their words muffled by distance and walls that I'd painted myself the year Daniel turned 15. I heard her say, "If we sell before the spring market, we could get at least 800,000. That's plenty to get something with a bigger yard, maybe closer to the good schools." My son murmured something, too low to catch. Then Lisa again. "We'll make it sound like it's her decision. She's tired, you can tell. We'll talk about assisted living, independence, community. She'll eat that up." The words rolled through the air like poison wrapped in velvet. I set my cup down slowly so it wouldn't clink. Independence. Community. Words that once meant freedom. Now they sounded like exile. It wasn't always like this. Daniel used to call me every Sunday just to ask how the tomatoes were doing if I needed anything from town. When he got married, he still called. Less often, but he did. Then Lisa started answering his phone for him. "He's busy, Martha. I'll have him call you back." He never did, but I told myself it was life. Everyone gets busy. Everyone forgets to call their mother once in a while. I didn't realize that once in a while could stretch into months. The first time they visited after Derek's funeral, Lisa brought candles as a gift. white, unscented, wrapped in gold ribbon. "To brighten things up," she said. I lit one that night and watched the wax melt, the wick trembling. It smelled like nothing, like the beginning of silence. Now, years later, I stood there and listened as that same woman planned my disappearance with the calm efficiency of a real estate agent closing a deal. Maybe I should have stormed in, shouted, "This house isn't wasted on me." But I didn't. I've learned that silence has its own sharpness. Instead, I picked up my rag again and kept wiping the frame of our wedding photo, though it was already spotless. When Derek looked at me from behind the glass, young, tanned, eyes laughing, I felt the same ache I'd felt the day we buried him. The kind of ache that reminds you you're still capable of pain, which means you're still alive. After they left that evening, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, like I was checking on someone who'd been sick. The light in the hallway had gone dim. One bulb flickered. In the dining room, the tablecloth was still folded neatly, the good china untouched. I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, feeling the little grooves Derek carved by accident when he built it. He wasn't a carpenter, but he insisted on making that table himself. "Something solid," he said. "Something that won't give up on us." 40 years later, it was still here. Still solid. Maybe that's why it annoyed Lisa so much, because she couldn't buy something that lasting. Upstairs, the guest room was perfectly made up. They always stayed there when they visited, though Lisa had started calling it the Blue Room. She said it sounded less depressing than the guest room. On the dresser, I noticed she'd left one of her silk scarves, pale beige, perfumed, faintly with something expensive. I picked it up, held it for a moment, then folded it and placed it inside the top drawer. That drawer used to hold Daniel's baby clothes, tiny socks, a yellow hat, the blanket I crocheted when I was pregnant. I'd kept it all until a few years ago when Lisa offered to help organize. Most of it went into boxes. I never saw them again. The house creaked as I moved through it, the way old houses do when they know you're listening. I stood by the window in my bedroom and looked at the oak tree outside. Derek planted it the same year we moved in. It had outlived him, outgrown everything. Its branches reached toward the roof now, and sometimes, on windy nights, they brushed the glass softly, like fingertips tapping for attention. Lisa wanted it gone. "It's too close to the house. It's dangerous." But it never felt dangerous to me. It felt protective, like something that remembered what roots are for. When I finally sat down on the edge of my bed, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, not even from anger, something smaller, sadder, the kind of shaking that comes when you realize the people you love have already decided who you are without asking you. I was still holding the rag. I set it down carefully on the nightstand, next to the photo of Daniel at age 7, missing a front tooth, grinning up at the camera with his arms around our old Labrador, Max. That boy had once cried because he thought I'd left him at the grocery store. Now the man he'd become was planning to leave me somewhere that smelled of disinfectant and floral air freshener. I thought of calling him that night, asking what he meant, giving him the chance to explain himself. But I didn't. I knew how that conversation would go. He'd sigh, rub his forehead, say, "Mom, you're overreacting. We just want what's best for you." And that's the problem with good sons. They always think they know what's best. They forget that their mothers were women before they were caretakers. I brushed my hair, turned off the lamp, and lay back in the dark. The house sighed around me. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed, steady and loyal. Outside, the wind moved through the oak leaves, whispering something I couldn't quite catch. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a promise. Before I fell asleep, I whispered to no one in particular. They said this house was wasted on me. Maybe they've forgotten I built it with my own 2 hands. My voice sounded small in the dark, but not weak. It sounded like a seed cracking open underground, ready to grow. The next morning began like any other, quiet and deliberate. The kind of morning that carries its own melancholy, even before the first cup of coffee. I woke before the alarm, as I always do, because after a certain age, the body keeps its own schedule, one that has little patience for clocks. The house was cool, the air faintly sweet with dust and last night's silence. I made coffee the old-fashioned way, the way Derek liked it, boiling water in the kettle, pouring it slowly over the grounds until the smell filled the kitchen and made the place feel inhabited again. I sat at the table and looked at the patch of light creeping across the floor. I tried to let the rhythm of small tasks calm me, but my mind was still heavy with what I'd overheard the day before. Words like wasted, sell, and you-assisted living kept circling back, sharp as pins. I kept thinking that maybe I had misunderstood, that perhaps they were just venting, that I had caught the wrong meaning between lines spoken too softly to be fair. But then I remembered the tone, the careful, managerial tone Lisa used when she was being efficient about other people's lives. There was no misunderstanding. There was a plan, and I was the project. Later that morning, the doorbell rang. Daniel stood there, his posture stiff, his eyes darting past me into the house as if checking to see whether it was still in one piece. "Morning, Mom," he said, with that too bright tone children use when they are about to ask for something they know they shouldn't. Behind him, Lisa held a cardboard box and a folder. She smiled, the kind of smile that hides sharp edges. "We thought we'd help you sort through some of the paperwork," she said, brushing past me into the hallway. "You know, bills, insurance, maybe see what needs updating." Her perfume trailed behind her like fog. I stood there for a moment, then closed the door. Daniel was already in the living room, looking around as if he hadn't seen it before, though every detail had his fingerprints. Every photograph, every piece of furniture he'd begged me to keep when he moved out, because it felt like home. Now he looked at it like a realtor sizing up square footage. Lisa spread papers across the coffee table. "You have a lot of old files here," she said, flipping through envelopes. "Medical, utilities, property tax. It's all a bit messy. We could simplify it for you." Her hands were neat, precise, never still. She pulled out one of the property folders and tapped it with her manicured nail. "This one especially. It's good to have everything organized in case of, well, you know, anything." I sat across from her, clasping my hands in my lap so she wouldn't see them tremble. "In case of what?" I asked. She smiled that polished smile. "In case you decide it's time to make a change. Assisted living communities handle most of this for you, so you won't have to worry." Daniel said nothing. He just stared at the floor. I wanted to believe they were just being practical, that this was some well-intentioned misstep. But then Lisa added, almost casually, "There's one in Maple Ridge with private rooms and an art studio. It's really nice. They even have a shuttle to the farmer's market on weekends." Her voice was light, rehearsed. I realized she had been preparing this conversation for weeks, maybe months. My stomach tightened. "You've been looking at places," I said. Daniel sighed. "Just exploring options, Mom. We thought it'd be easier for you, you know? Less upkeep, less stress. You could meet people. I meet people, I said quietly. At church, at the library, in my garden. He rubbed his forehead. That's not the same. Lisa leaned forward. You'd have more safety. They monitor things like medication, blood pressure, all that. She said it like a kindness. I could feel heat rising in my face. I've been a nurse for 30 years, I said. I know how to take a pill. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she smoothed it back into place. Of course, we just worry. You've had a few falls. Once, I corrected, and it was in 2018. Daniel looked at me, soft but patronizing. We're just trying to help, Mom. Help? That word again. I'd spent half my life helping other people. Patients who couldn't walk. Neighbors who couldn't pay their bills. A husband dying too young. A son trying to become someone in a world that never stopped demanding more. And now help had become a way to erase me. I looked at them both sitting there, so sure of themselves, surrounded by my furniture, my photographs, my air, and realized they'd already redrawn the map of my life without me on it. Lisa stood up. We'll come back Sunday, she said. We can start sorting the attic. Sorting? I asked. You mean throwing away? She laughed lightly. Decluttering. You'll thank me later. I didn't answer. I watched as they carried the box back to the car. From the window, I saw Daniel pause at the porch steps, his head bent as if weighing something. For a moment, I thought he might come back, might say, We're sorry, Mom. This was too much. Instead, he just adjusted his jacket and walked to the car. The engine started, and the sound faded down the street, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and finality. When the house was quiet again, I sat down and opened the folder they had left behind. Inside were pamphlets, glossy, cheerful things with pictures of gray-haired people painting, laughing, holding yoga poses. The taglines read, Independent Living for a New You. Your next chapter starts here. Freedom without worry. I turned each page slowly, as if reading an obituary. They didn't see what I saw in those pictures. The emptiness behind the staged smiles. The way every room looked like it could belong to anyone, and therefore to no one. I closed the folder and pressed my hand flat against it, feeling the slick paper cool under my palm. I thought of the oak tree again, its branches stretching stubbornly toward the light, refusing to be trimmed into symmetry. The afternoon dragged on. I tried to busy myself with chores, laundry, dishes, watering the plants, but every sound in the house echoed with accusation. When I passed the hallway mirror, I caught sight of my reflection again. The lines around my mouth looked deeper, the eyes darker. I thought of Derek, how we'd stood in this same hallway 40 years ago after signing the mortgage papers. We were terrified, exhilarated, young. He'd squeezed my hand and said, This house is ours. No one can take it unless we let them. I had laughed then, thinking he meant the bank. I didn't know the thieves would come wearing family smiles. Just after dusk, I heard a knock. It was the mail carrier, holding a stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band. Got some extras today, he said. I thanked him, took them inside, and sat at the kitchen table to sort through them. Bills, circulars, a church bulletin, and then a thick envelope with my name written in blue ink. The return address was a law firm, Caldwell and Stein, the same one Daniel used for his business. My hands went cold. I opened it carefully. Inside, a neatly typed letter. Per your son's request, please find enclosed the preliminary paperwork regarding power of attorney and the proposed management of property at 104 Maple Lane. The words blurred for a second, as if the room tilted. Beneath it was a second sheet, unsigned but already filled out. My name printed under grantor, Daniel's name under grantee. I sat very still. The kettle on the stove began to whistle faintly, forgotten. I let it. My mind moved through the years. Every time I'd said yes, every time I'd trusted him, every time I'd believed that kindness was enough to keep cruelty away. I had given him everything, my savings, my time, my quiet faith. And now he was taking the last thing that tied me to myself. When the whistle grew too loud, I turned off the flame and leaned against the counter. The air smelled faintly of metal and steam. I folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside the sink. I didn't tear it. Not yet. There's a kind of dignity in waiting until the right moment to burn something. Night settled slowly. I turned on the porch light, though I knew no one was coming. The glow spread across the steps, soft and uneven, catching the edge of the rose bush Derek planted. I could hear the faint hum of the highway a mile away, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through the oak leaves. Everything familiar, everything unchanged, and yet I felt the ground shifting beneath me. For the first time, the house didn't feel like protection. It felt like a promise someone was trying to steal. I poured myself a small glass of sherry and sat by the window. On the table beside me lay one of the pamphlets Lisa had left, open to a page that showed a smiling woman playing cards under the caption, "Where every day feels like home." I looked around at my own walls, the scuffed baseboards, the slightly uneven wallpaper, the clock that still ran 5 minutes slow, and thought, they don't know what home feels like. They think it's brightness and order and fresh paint. But home is the sound of floorboards that remember your steps, the smell of your own skin on the pillow, the drawer you can open in the dark without looking. Somewhere deep inside, a line drew itself, a quiet, invisible border between what they thought was best for me and what I knew I could still claim. I didn't have a plan yet, only a pulse, slow and steady, like something ancient stirring. I took one last sip of sherry and whispered into the empty room, "Not yet. Not like this." The house creaked in reply, and for the first time all day, I didn't feel alone. They didn't storm my life with boxes and realtors all at once. They seeped in, like water under a door you forgot to check, the kind that seems harmless until you notice your socks are wet and the wood has already begun to swell. It started the next Sunday with a text from Daniel. He rarely called anymore, perhaps afraid my voice would weaken whatever script he and Lisa had rehearsed. He wrote that they were coming by to help with the attic and added a smiling face, as if we were talking about something festive and not an autopsy. I made a pot of coffee anyway, out of reflex or habit or hope. I'm still not sure which. When their car pulled up, I watched from the kitchen window as Lisa stepped out in her clean boots and beautiful coat, Daniel already unloading folded cardboard boxes from the trunk. They didn't come empty-handed. They came prepared. For what exactly, I was just beginning to understand. Lisa kissed the air near my cheek and told me I looked good, which in her mouth sounded like still functional. Daniel checked the thermostat before taking off his jacket. He'd started doing that lately, like the house couldn't regulate itself without his approval. "We'll start in the attic," he said in the tone I remembered from his teenage years, the one he used when he thought he was taking charge of his own destiny. "Just sorting, Mom. Nothing major." "You don't have to climb up, just tell us what's important." It was an efficient way to cut me out, the narrative of care disguising the strategy of control. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs and listened to them move through my boxes, the ones labeled in my handwriting: baby clothes, Christmas, Derek's tools, taxes, letters. The wooden beams creaked under their weight. Dust sifted through the cracks in small sighs. Every so often there would be a small laugh, the sound of Lisa discovering some relic that didn't fit her idea of a streamlined life. "She kept all this?" I heard her say. "Old mixing bowls, rusted tins, broken ornaments?" Daniel's voice, softer. "Yeah, she keeps everything." Not said with affection, stated like a diagnosis. She began calling down for permission in a tone that suggested my answers had already been decided. "This cracked lamp? Trash, right?" I pictured the lamp in her hands, the ugly little ceramic base Derek found at a flea market on our 5th anniversary, the one we both hated but couldn't throw away because we'd carried it 3 miles in the rain, laughing until we were soaked through. "Keep it," I said. A pause. "These old coats?" "Keep." "This box of recipes? They're all stained and faded." "Keep." Each time I refused their easy exits, I could feel Lisa's patience fray. She started to translate my choices for Daniel. "She's clinging," she said once, not knowing the floorboards carried everything. "It's normal at her age." Normal at my age, as though I were a weather pattern to be endured. They came back the next weekend and the next, each time with a new pretext. Daniel wanted to check the fuse box, though it had worked fine since 1986. Lisa wanted to reorganize the pantry because some of the expiration dates made her nervous. I watched as she pulled down jars I'd canned myself: peaches in syrup, tomatoes with basil, plum jam, and lined them up on the counter like suspects waiting for judgment. "These are too old," she murmured. "This isn't safe. You can't eat this stuff." It felt like a verdict on more than fruit. Without asking, she began placing things into large black trash bags, the good sturdy ones I'd used for leaves. "I'll take this to the dump," Daniel said, tying a knot. The bag sagged with the weight of my summers, my Christmases, my Tuesday afternoons. "I didn't say you could throw those away," I told him. It came out too quietly. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then forced a smile. "It's just junk, Mom. We're making space." I let the bag go. I picked my battles that day, and I still don't know if I chose wisely. Slowly, the house began to shift. Chairs were moved to open up the room. A rug was rolled and taken because it's a tripping hazard. You don't need the risk. The family photos on the hallway wall got subtly rearranged after one visit. My wedding picture slid to the far edge, nearly at the corner, while a more recent photo of Daniel and Lisa at a wine tasting event found its way to the center. When I saw it, something in me clenched, not from jealousy, but from the accuracy of the symbolism. I had been gently relocated to the periphery in my own home. Lisa bought new pillows for the sofa without asking, pale and textured and impractical, and dropped them with a flourish. "These make it look fresher," she said. "Less dated." I didn't bother asking what dated meant. I knew. It meant me. Neighbors began to knock less on my door and more on theirs when they visited on Sundays. One afternoon, I stepped out to water the roses and heard Mrs. Kane, from across the street, tell Lisa in a conspiratorial murmur. It's so good you two are stepping in. It must be a lot for her to manage all this now. This house is so big. Lisa replied with a sigh, perfectly calibrated for sympathy. We're doing what we can. She's very attached. I smiled at them both and turned the hose onto the base of the climbing rose, soaking the soil until it turned black and rich. They spoke about me as if I were at the far end of a long hospital ward, half asleep and hard of hearing. I was 3 steps away, and I could quote every word. Inside, Daniel started leaving little hints the way people leave pamphlets in waiting rooms. On the kitchen counter, a brochure for a continuing care community with soft focus pictures of geraniums and white-haired couples playing chess. On the fridge, a magnet with the hotline number for senior ride services, which I hadn't asked for. By the phone, the business card of Caldwell & Stein, the law firm whose envelope still lay hidden in my drawer. Just resources, he said when I asked about them. Just options. We want you to feel secure. There's a very particular cruelty in being smothered with concern while someone's fingers are closing around your throat. My routines began to feel like performances in a house under inspection. If I forgot to rinse a cup, Lisa would notice it next visit, holding it between thumb and forefinger like evidence. You shouldn't have to deal with all this, Martha, she'd say. Imagine a place where someone does it for you. If I moved a chair back to how I liked it, Daniel would frown the next time and nudge it again. We don't want you to trip, he'd murmur. One Sunday, he installed grab bars in my bathroom without asking. It's safer, he said, and I could not argue with the logic of safety, only with the assumption that I had lost the right to decide what my own life required. There were moments, fleeting, shameful, when I wondered if they were right. When I woke up with my hip aching. When the grocery bags felt heavier than they used to. When I lost my glasses and found them in the refrigerator, of all places, next to the eggs. Those little slips frightened me more than I let on, because I could hear Lisa's voice in my head, kindly and cold. She can't keep up. It's too much. The fear didn't make me trust them more. It made me quieter. Silence is how women my age are trained to survive. We swallow our panic so the people we love won't call it proof. Still, there were things that anchored me. The oak tree in the yard, steady as a sentinel. The crack in the third stair I could navigate in the dark. The smell of Derek's aftershave lingering in the old wool coat still hanging in the hallway closet. The sound of the mail slot clacking at 11 every morning. One day, the mail brought a glossy flyer addressed not to me, but to current resident. On the front, thinking of selling? Now is the time. With a photo of a couple standing in front of a house that looked uncomfortably like mine. I tossed it into the trash, but later, as I emptied the bin, I saw a similar flyer in there already, folded precisely, as if someone else had decided I didn't need to see it. That's when the unease coalesced into something sharper. They weren't just thinking about my comfort. They were thinking about timing. Then came the evening that scraped away the last bits of plausible deniability. They'd stayed later than usual, lingering after dinner. I'd made pot roast because Daniel loved it as a boy. Lisa had eaten politely, cutting each bite too small, drinking more wine than usual. When the dishes were cleared, they moved to the living room. I stayed in the kitchen, washing plates, listening to the murmur of their voices. I shouldn't have heard, but this house carries the truth whether you invite it or not. Lisa's voice, low and tired. We can't wait forever. The market is peaking now. Another year and we'll lose at least 100,000. Daniel's reply, I know. But she's not signing anything yet. She's being stubborn. Then Lisa, sharper. You're her only child. You have to be the adult. She's just sitting on it. That house is wasted on her. You said yourself she barely uses half the rooms. Silence. A clink of glass. Then my son's answer, quieter than I have ever heard him. I'll talk to her again. There it was, laid bare between the sound of running water and the faint buzz of the light above the sink. Not concern, not love, not fear for my well-being, strategy, investment, timeline. I switched off the tap and stood with my hands plunged into cold, soapy water, staring at the window. My reflection looked back at me, warped slightly by steam, eyes dark and intent. I didn't cry. I think I had moved past that some time ago without noticing. Tears are a kind of petition, and I was done asking anyone for anything. After they left, I walked the house the way a nurse walks a ward at night, checking each room for signs of decline. The guest bed was made with the new beige linens Lisa preferred. My old quilt was folded at the foot like a visitor's blanket. In the living room, the brochure for Maple Ridge Senior Community had been moved to the very center of my coffee table, placed where my hands would naturally rest if I reached for the remote. One of the rose-scented candles they'd gifted me months ago sat unlit beside it, label turned outward. Comfort and renewal. Upstairs, I found that 2 boxes from the attic had been brought down and tucked against the wall in my bedroom. On top sat a sticky note in Lisa's slanted writing. We'll go through these next time. Lots can go. I ran my fingers over the cardboard lid and felt something inside me curl in on itself, then push back. It is a strange sensation. Becoming a guest in the house you chose, you scrubbed, you paid for in night shifts and worn-out shoes. It doesn't happen in a single day. It's a series of small permissions you never consciously give. One chair moved, one picture rehung, one cupboard reorganized for ease. One legal document drafted just in case. Each step is reasonable on its own. Together, they trace the outline of your disappearance. I lay down that night fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, and realized they were not just rearranging my things. They were rehearsing for my absence. And the worst part, the part that made sleep impossible, was that they assumed I would cooperate, that I would shuffle neatly into their plan, because it was wrapped in the language of love. It was 2 days after their last visit when I went looking for a particular folder in the study. A folder I hadn't touched in years, one that lived behind a row of cookbooks and forgotten photo albums on the bottom shelf of the old oak cabinet. I wasn't searching for it consciously. I had only intended to find the receipt for a repairman to prove to Daniel that the heater was perfectly fine. But when I pulled at the stack, something heavier than paper slid loose and fell onto the rug with a soft thud. It was the brown leather folder Derek used for important things, the one he kept locked even after we'd retired the old safe. For a moment I just stared at it, running my hand along the cracked spine, breathing in the dry, musty scent of a life once kept in order. When I finally opened it, the first thing I saw was the mortgage deed, yellowed but perfectly legible, still in both our names. Beneath it, our joint savings certificates, the final payment receipt, and a letter from the bank dated 1989. Congratulations. Your home is now fully yours. The words hit me with a quiet, physical force, the kind that doesn't make you cry but steadies your back. It was as if Derek had reached across the years to place his palm between my shoulder blades and remind me, nothing in this house could be taken without my consent. I sat there for a long time, The papers spread around me like a small camp of witnesses. I remembered the day we signed them, Derek's ink-smudged fingers, my trembling excitement, the smell of coffee and sawdust in the air, because the floors had only just been sanded. We were young and so sure of ourselves, standing in that half-finished house, telling each other that no matter what came, this would be the one thing no one could strip away. I thought of how he'd worked double shifts at the mill, how I'd taken extra night rounds at the hospital just to pay off that mortgage early. Every scrape, every blister, every fight about bills had ended with one shared promise. This place would be our legacy, the ground under our son's feet, not his inheritance to cash, but his home to remember. Somewhere between that day and this one, the promise had warped into something unrecognizable. I traced our signatures with my thumb, his bold, slanted, confident, mine careful and smaller, and felt something in me harden into clarity. The next morning, I called the law office that had handled our closing 40 years ago. I didn't even know if they still existed, but the number connected. A young woman answered, bright-voiced and polite, and when I explained what I was looking for, proof of title, confirmation of sole ownership, she promised to check the archives. "We can email you a digital copy, ma'am," she said. "But it may take a few days." "I'll wait," I told her. Then, on impulse, I asked, "And if I wanted to make changes to my will, do you still offer that service?" There was a pause, then a practiced warmth. "Of course. Would you like to make an appointment?" "Not yet," I said, "but soon." I hung up and sat there, phone heavy in my hand, heart steady in my chest. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a subject being managed. I felt like someone quietly preparing her defense. That afternoon, I went into the attic by myself. The air up there was thick with dust and the faint scent of cedar and old fabric. Sunlight spilled through the small, round window, catching on motes that drifted like tiny ghosts. Boxes were scattered in awkward piles from Daniel and Lisa's last visit, some open, others half-taped. I knelt by one marked Derek Tools and lifted the lid. The metal smell of wrenches and nails rose up, raw and comforting. Beneath them lay a folded canvas bag, and inside it a small ledger notebook in Derek's handwriting. He'd kept records of every repair he'd done on the house. Each coat of paint, each nail driven into the beams, every dollar spent. At the end of the last page, written in faint pencil, were the words, "If you keep it standing, it'll keep you standing too." I sat back on my heels and smiled, not sadly this time, but with something that felt like agreement. I spent the rest of the day moving slowly through the house, touching things I'd stopped noticing. The uneven patch Derek had plastered over the years before he died, the faint outline of Daniel's height marks still visible on the kitchen doorway, the worn indent in the couch where I sat to read after dinner. I realized that everything they called clutter was a map of continuity. To them, the house was a piece of property, square footage, equity, potential. To me, it was biography. Every scratch on the floorboards was an entry. Every chipped plate was an anecdote. I began taking notes in a small spiral pad, the one I usually kept by the phone. I wrote down memories attached to each room. When the wallpaper was changed, who gave us the dining set? What song was playing the day Derek painted the shutters blue? It felt obsessive, maybe even futile, but it steadied me. There's power in remembering. It's a form of resistance that doesn't make noise but builds roots. A few days later, Daniel called. His voice was gentle, too gentle, the tone of someone approaching a nervous patient. "Mom, Lisa, and I were talking," he began, "and we think it's time to start getting things in order. We don't want you stressed about anything later on." I knew that in order meant under control. I let him talk, nodding silently though he couldn't see me. He mentioned that Lisa's cousin, a financial advisor, could help streamline my accounts, and that they'd found a nice young lawyer who specialized in family transitions. The vocabulary of care was evolving into the syntax of conquest. When he paused for breath, I said evenly, "I've already contacted my own lawyer, thank you." The silence that followed was delicious. "Oh," he said finally, trying to recover. "That's good, Mom. Just want to make sure you're comfortable." "I am," I said. "More than you think." We exchanged a few more pleasantries before hanging up, but something had shifted. He knew now that I was no longer a passive variable in his plans. That night, I sat by the window with a candle burning low and reread the bank letter again. Outside, the oak tree moved in the wind, its branches tapping softly against the glass, as though keeping time with my thoughts. I realized that Derek's tree and my house were part of the same promise, things built to outlast our errors. They didn't require perfection, only tending. I had stopped tending for a while, distracted by grief and routine, letting others define what was practical. But practicality is often just the language of surrender, dressed up to look like virtue. I decided to change small things first, to remind the house that I was still its keeper. I brought down my old quilt and spread it back over the guest bed. I took Lisa's beige pillows and set them in the closet. I rehung my wedding photo at the center of the hallway wall. I even polished Derek's tools, wiping each handle as if blessing them. It wasn't rebellion in the loud sense. It was reclamation in the quiet one. The next morning, I went to the notary's office downtown, the same one I hadn't visited since Derek's death certificate needed filing. The clerk looked at me with mild surprise, but was polite enough not to ask why I was there. I requested copies of the property deed, our tax receipts, and the records of title transfer. "Do you want them mailed?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'll take them now." She printed the papers, handed them to me in a manila envelope, and I walked home with them under my arm, feeling oddly lighter. On the way back, I stopped by the small bakery where Derek used to buy Sunday buns. The owner, a woman my age with kind eyes, recognized me instantly. "Haven't seen you in forever, Martha," she said. "You still in that big house?" I nodded. "Still standing." She smiled. "Good. Don't ever leave it. You'd disappear anywhere else." It was a simple thing to say, but it went through me like sunlight through stained glass. That evening, when I got home, I opened the windows in every room. The house breathed again. The scent of autumn came in. Damp leaves, faint smoke, a touch of rain. I took a long time walking through the rooms, touching the cool window frames, feeling the slow pulse of ownership that hummed beneath the dust. I realized that this house was not just memory, but witness. It had seen too much to belong to anyone else. When I reached the kitchen, I took the folder, the new papers, the notary stamps, and placed them all in the top drawer next to the telephone, neatly aligned, ready. Then I made tea and wrote a single sentence in my spiral pad. "I am not leaving. I am preparing." Later, in bed, I allowed myself to think about Daniel and Lisa without bitterness, which felt like a small miracle. They weren't villains, not really. They were just young enough to believe in the myth of progress, the idea that everything valuable must yield to something newer, sleeker, more manageable. They didn't understand that some forms of endurance are worth the inconvenience. I almost pitied them. But pity is dangerous. It can make you forgive what shouldn't be forgiven. Instead, I made a quieter vow to outwait them. They could underestimate me all they wanted. The years have made me patient, and patience is its own kind of weapon. As the house settled into night, I felt the calm of decision wrap around me. The noises, the distant hum of the heater, the creak of the floorboards, the soft ticking of the hallway clock, all sounded different now, like affirmations instead of laments. I understood suddenly that the midpoint of a life, even one near its end, isn't a matter of age or time. It's a matter of recognition. You reach a line where being diminished stops feeling inevitable and starts feeling optional. I lay there under my old quilt, the deed safe in the drawer, and whispered to Derek in the dark, "They think I'm finished, love, but they have no idea how long a woman can stand when she's standing on her own ground." The first sign that they were moving faster came disguised as something ordinary, the way storms often start with just a change in the smell of the air. It was a Friday morning in late October, the kind of morning that carries both chill and light in equal measure, when Daniel called to say he was dropping by for a quick check-in. His tone was casual, rehearsed, his words arranged with the precision of someone who had already decided what the conversation would be. I knew better than to argue over the phone. It gives them a head start. I simply said, "All right," and returned to the pot of soup simmering on the stove, stirring slowly, as if the rhythm could steady me. When the knock came 2 hours later, it wasn't just Daniel. It was Daniel and a man in a dark jacket carrying a clipboard, the kind of man who walks into spaces believing he's entitled to measure them. "This is Paul," Daniel said quickly, not meeting my eyes. "He's just taking a look, nothing official." "We were talking about repairs last week, remember?" I hadn't been part of that "we." Paul smiled, a professional kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Just evaluating some property features," he said, already stepping past the threshold before I could answer. I stood still, my hand tightening around the wooden spoon. Daniel followed him into the living room, gesturing as he spoke. Square footage, natural light, foundation, roof. Words that belonged to transactions, not memories. They moved from room to room, the man scribbling in his notebook, nodding, murmuring in agreement, while Daniel offered little anecdotes that sounded practiced. "Yeah, she's had this place for decades. Beautiful, really. Just needs some updates." I didn't speak until they reached the dining room, where Derek's table sat under the window, the sunlight spilling across its scarred surface. "It doesn't need updates," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended, steady but cold. Both men paused. Paul cleared his throat, glanced at Daniel, and said lightly, "Of course, ma'am. Just doing a general assessment." I set the spoon down on the table, wiped my hands on my apron, and looked directly at him. "And who asked you to do that?" Daniel stepped forward quickly. "Mom, it's fine. He's just giving me an idea, just so we know what we're dealing with if we ever need repairs." "Repairs?" I repeated, tasting the word. "You mean selling?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through the air. Paul looked at his clipboard, then at Daniel. "Maybe I should—" "Yes," I said. "You should." He nodded awkwardly, muttered something about scheduling, and hurried toward the door. Daniel didn't move. When the door shut, I turned to him. "You brought a realtor into my home," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not like that, Mom. We're just planning ahead." "Planning what? My disappearance?" He winced. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "It's accurate." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I watched him, The lines around his eyes, the twitch in his jaw, the same expression he had as a boy when he'd been caught lying about breaking something he couldn't replace. "You think I'm stupid," I said finally. He started to protest, but I cut him off. Don't use that voice. The one that sounds like kindness but means control." His shoulders slumped slightly, and for a flicker of time, I saw guilt cross his face. "We just want to make sure you're okay," he said quietly. "We can't always be here, and Lisa worries about property taxes," I interrupted. "She worries about market value, about timing. I've heard her." He looked away, and in that small avoidance, I found confirmation. When he left that afternoon, the air felt altered, thinner somehow. I went through the house slowly, touching the walls as though checking for a pulse. The smell of Paul's cologne still lingered faintly in the living room, something sterile and expensive that didn't belong. I opened all the windows to let it out, letting the cold air rush through. As I did, I saw Mrs. Kane across the street standing at her mailbox. She waved at me, tentative, then crossed over. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, voice laced with that practiced concern people use when they already know something. "I saw a man with a clipboard. Appraiser, right?" "Something like that," I said. Her mouth tightened. "Well, I hope they don't pressure you. You know how it goes. My niece's kids tried to move her out last year, said it was for her own good. She's miserable now. Smells like bleach and silence in those places." I nodded, and for the first time in weeks, I felt less alone. When she left, she patted my hand. "Keep your name on everything, Martha. That's your shield." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the look on Daniel's face when I confronted him. Not angry, not even ashamed, but resigned. Like a man carrying out an unpleasant duty he'd already justified to himself. I realized then that he'd stopped seeing me as a person capable of choice. To him, I was a variable, an obstacle in the equation of his comfort. That realization didn't break me. It clarified me. I rose from bed, went downstairs, and pulled out the folder I'd hidden in the drawer. I placed it on the table, opened it to the deed, and reread every line until dawn. The following week, Lisa called. Her voice was brisk, cheerful, full of unearned authority. "Martha, we need to have a family conversation," she said. "About the future." I said nothing. "Daniel told me what happened with the appraiser." "You scared the poor man half to death." She laughed, the brittle kind of laugh that signals irritation. "We just need to get organized. It's better for everyone if things are clear now rather than later." I waited until she finished. "The only thing that needs to be clear," I said slowly, "is that this house isn't for sale." She sighed, as if speaking to a stubborn patient. "I understand you're attached, but you have to think practically. It's a lot to manage. You could have such an easier life. Cleaners, meals, company. We could find a place with a garden." "There is a garden," I said. "One that doesn't need to be approved by a management board." "You're being emotional," she snapped, her patience cracking. "You're not thinking straight." "No," I said softly. "I'm thinking straighter than I have in years." The next time they visited, they didn't bring boxes. They brought forms. A neat stack of printed documents, paper-clipped and labeled, waiting on the coffee table like polite assassins. Lisa spoke first. "We drafted something simple, just in case. It's power of attorney. You'd still have full control, of course, but it would let Daniel help manage things if something happened." I stared at the papers, then at my son. His eyes avoided mine. "You already filled in my name," I said. Lisa smiled tightly. "Just to make it easier for you. All you have to do is sign." The pen they offered gleamed in her hand, heavy and silver. I didn't take it. Instead, I leaned forward slowly, folded the papers once, then again, then tore them down the middle. The sound was clean, satisfying. Lisa gasped. Daniel stood frozen. "I'm not signing away what I built," I said. "And if you bring me another piece of paper like that, I will have the locks changed." Lisa's voice trembled with outrage. "You can't talk to us like that." "Watch me," I said. After that, things grew quiet. Not peaceful, but calculatingly quiet. The calls became shorter, the visits less frequent, but more strategic. They began showing up unannounced, pretending it was casual, their eyes scanning for signs of weakness. I made sure there were none to find. I kept the house immaculate, the garden trimmed, the bills paid ahead of time. I learned to leave the kettle boiling when they came, so there would always be a small, steady noise filling the silence they tried to weaponize. Still, I could feel their frustration building. Lisa began sending articles, links about aging safely and downsizing gracefully. Daniel texted reminders about doctor appointments I hadn't scheduled. The language of love had curdled into a soft, managerial aggression. One evening in November, I found a notice slipped under my door, a glossy flyer from a real estate agency with the words, "We have buyers ready," printed across it. No address, no name, but I knew who had arranged it. My phone rang moments later, Daniel's voice again, careful, too even. "Mom, did you get the flyer?" "I did," I said. "Then you know what I'm talking about. It's just information." "Information for whom?" I asked. "For you? Or for the people waiting for me to die?" He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost pleading. "Why are you making this so hard?" "Because it's mine," I said. "Because I still live here." A week later, I heard the front gate creak open and saw Lisa standing outside with a man I didn't recognize, this one in a suit, holding a small camera. She didn't knock. I opened the door before she could lift her hand. "We're just taking some preliminary photos," she said brightly, as if this were perfectly normal behavior. "You don't have to do anything, just stay out of frame." I stepped onto the porch, blocking the doorway. "There will be no photos," I said. The man shifted awkwardly. Lisa's smile hardened. "You can't stop us from planning." "Watch me," I said again. The man looked at her, uncertain, then turned back toward the street. She followed, muttering something about stubborn old women. I stood there until their car disappeared, the cold air biting at my cheeks. That night, I sat at the table with the deed spread before me once more. But this time, I added something new beside it. A letter I had drafted with the help of the notary, transferring the future ownership of the house into a charitable trust under my conditions. It wasn't finalized yet, but the framework was there. The house would become a transitional home for widowed or displaced women, and I would live here until my last breath. The lawyer had looked surprised at first, but respectful. "Are you sure?" she'd asked. "It's a bold move." "No," I told her. "It's justice." When I sealed the envelope with the preliminary draft, I felt something loosen inside me, a knot untying that had been there since the first overheard insult. They had wanted to erase me by absorbing what I had built. Instead, I would make it unclaimable. Not for them, not for profit, but for continuity, for meaning. The power they tried to wield would become the foundation of something that couldn't serve them. I imagined Derek's face then, the small, proud tilt of his chin, and I thought, "You'd like this, wouldn't you?" 2 days later, Daniel came again, this time alone. He stood in the doorway, looking suddenly older, uncertain. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't mean for things to get so ugly." I nodded. Ugly is just the truth showing its face. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Lisa thinks we should stop pushing." I agree. "But I need to understand. Why are you so determined to stay here?" His question was genuine, maybe even tender. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because this house remembers me," I said. "When I walk through it, it doesn't ask me to justify my existence. It doesn't look past me. Every wall, every corner says, 'You were here, you mattered.' Can your new house say that?" He didn't answer. His eyes were wet, but whether from remorse or exhaustion I couldn't tell. When he left, I didn't follow him to the door. I stayed where I was, hands on the table, the deed beneath my fingers. The light through the window shifted to gold, the long kind of evening light that makes everything softer, forgiving even the ugliest truths. I realized then that the real confrontation wasn't between me and them. It was between me and the version of myself that had been too polite, too careful, too willing to shrink for the sake of harmony. That woman had kept the peace, but at the cost of her dignity. This one, the one sitting in the fading sunlight, had found something better than peace. She had found her border, and she intended to defend it. It happened quietly, without the ceremony of confrontation I had once imagined, the kind of quiet that feels both fragile and irreversible. I had been to the notary that morning, a cold and gray Monday, and signed the final documents transferring the future of the house to the trust. My hand didn't tremble. In fact, it moved with the calm steadiness I hadn't felt in years, as if every hesitation had finally burned itself out. The woman across the desk smiled gently, sliding the papers into a folder stamped with an embossed seal. "There," she said. "It's official. You'll receive a certified copy in a few days. And just to confirm, you retain full life tenancy until your passing. No one can evict, sell, or alter the property without violating the legal charter." I nodded, listening to the words like a prayer. The ink wasn't even dry, but something inside me shifted, a pulse of finality that tasted like freedom. I walked out into the drizzle and felt the air on my face, thin and sharp. The world looked the same, but it wasn't. For the first time since Derek died, I wasn't guarding something fragile. I was wielding something certain. When I came home, the house was dim. I left the door unlocked, out of habit maybe, or superstition. The kettle was still half full from breakfast. I lit the burner and stood at the sink, watching the flame. Every corner of that kitchen had a memory, layered like sediment. Daniel's laughter bouncing off the tile when he was 8. Derek's tired shoulders in the late hours of the night. My own reflection in the window, older every year, but still here, always here. I poured the water into the teapot and carried it to the table, setting it next to the signed copy of the trust documents I'd kept for myself. They lay there, a modest pile of paper that held the full weight of my life. I was halfway through my first cup when I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside, followed by the crunch of feet on gravel. I knew that walk. Daniel. He hadn't called ahead, which meant something was coming. I didn't move to meet him. I waited. The door opened, hesitated, then closed. He stepped into the kitchen, pale from the cold, his jaw set in the way it always was when he wanted to stay calm, but was already losing the fight. Behind him came Lisa, wrapped in her fur-lined coat, her face tight with determination. "Mom," Daniel began, voice cautious, "we need to talk." I gestured toward the table. "Then talk." Lisa didn't sit. She stood near the doorway, her eyes flicking toward the stack of papers. "What's that?" she asked. "Something that doesn't concern you," I said. She let out a small, brittle laugh. "Everything concerning this house concerns us." Daniel rubbed his temples. "Lisa got a call," he said slowly. "From Caldwell and Stein. They said there was a title inquiry on the property. Something about a trust." I took another sip of tea, steady. "That's correct," I said. "I signed the paperwork this morning." Lisa blinked. "You what?" "I transferred the house to a women's housing trust," I said, almost conversationally. "It will be a shelter for widows and women with nowhere to go. I'll stay here for the rest of my life. When I'm gone, it'll be theirs." The silence grew heavy between us, thick as a storm cloud. Lisa's cheeks flushed, her voice tightening. "You can't do that." "I just did." "You don't understand what you've done," she hissed. "You've given away everything. Everything Daniel worked for. Everything your grandchildren could have had." "They'll have plenty," I said. "Just not this. This isn't inheritance. It's history." Daniel's voice came low, strained. "Mom, please. You don't have to do this out of spite." I looked at him. The same eyes I'd once taught to read, the same hands that had once clung to my sleeve crossing the street. "It's not spite, Daniel. It's memory. It's protection. It's something you'll thank me for one day, when you realize I saved you from becoming someone cruel." He looked away. Lisa was pacing now, the sharp click of her heels cutting the air. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous this is? You're giving a house worth nearly $1 million to strangers." "They won't be strangers," I said. "They'll be women like me. Women you would never notice, who outlive their usefulness and get pushed aside. You'll see them one day, and maybe you'll understand." Lisa slammed her hand on the table. "You're insane." I stood slowly, the chair legs scraping against the floor, not loud, but deliberate. "I've been called worse by people who loved me more." My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. She took a step back. Daniel's face was pale, conflicted, his lips pressed into a tight line. "You should have talked to me," he whispered. "I'm your son." "I tried," I said. "But every time I spoke, you listened for permission, not for meaning. You already had your version of my life planned out." I picked up the folder and held it out to him. "If you want to see what I've done, read it. It's legal. It's permanent." He hesitated, then took it with trembling hands. Lisa leaned over his shoulder, scanning the first page. Her eyes widened. "Clause 17, she muttered, reading aloud. "The donor, Martha Hale, retains irrevocable lifetime tenancy and exclusive occupancy rights." She looked up, her face twisting. "You've locked us out, literally." "That's one way to put it," I said. For a long while, no one spoke. The kettle began to whistle softly, as if reminding us that time continued even in moments like these. Daniel finally sank into a chair, the papers trembling in his grip. "I don't understand why," he said, almost pleading. "Why couldn't we just handle this together?" I looked at him, feeling a tired kind of tenderness. Because together meant losing myself. You wanted to help me disappear politely. I've spent enough years being polite. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, I saw a trace of the boy he used to be, the one who believed love was enough to keep everything intact. Lisa reached for his arm. "Come on, we're done here." But he didn't move. He stared at the documents again, then at me, searching for something I couldn't give him. "So that's it," he said quietly. "That's really it." I nodded. "That's really it!" They left not long after, Lisa slamming the door so hard that the old window panes rattled. I stood in the silence that followed, letting it settle around me. The house seemed to exhale, every beam and floorboard relaxing into the stillness. I gathered the teacups, poured out what was left in the pot, and washed them slowly, methodically. The water was warm, the motions familiar, grounding. When I looked out the window, I saw the sky clearing, the faintest trace of light breaking through the gray. The next morning, I woke early, earlier than usual. The world outside was washed clean by the night's rain. The air smelled like earth and renewal. I put on Derek's old flannel coat and went outside barefoot, the grass cool beneath my feet. The oak tree stood tall, its branches heavy with drops of water that glimmered in the new sunlight. I ran my hand along the trunk, feeling the rough bark under my palm. "We did it," I whispered. The tree didn't answer, of course, but a small gust of wind moved through its branches, scattering droplets that landed softly on my face. It felt like a benediction. Later that day, a courier arrived with the official stamped copy from the notary's office. I signed the receipt and took the folder inside. It was heavier than it should have been, or maybe I had simply become aware of its weight in a new way. I sat at the table again, opened it, and traced my signature with one finger. Beneath it was the notary's seal, embossed and final. "Irrevocable," the paper read. "Irrevocable." Such a small word, and yet it felt enormous, as if I had signed my name into the ground itself. By evening, word had spread among the neighbors. Mrs. Kane stopped by with a pie, pretending it was just a friendly visit, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. "Heard you made quite the move," she said softly. "They won't be happy." "They'll live," I said. "Maybe even better without this house hanging over them." She smiled, set the pie down, and squeezed my hand. "You did right. Most of us never get to keep the last word." That night, I walked through the house one more time, turning off lights, touching walls, breathing in the quiet. The air felt lighter, freer, almost young. I ended in the hallway, standing before my wedding photo, the same one Lisa had tried to relegate to the corner months ago. I reached up and straightened the frame. Derek looked back at me, forever smiling in that crooked, hopeful way. "It's ours again," I told him, "all the way to the end." The clock in the living room struck 9, each chime echoing softly through the rooms. I listened to the sound until it faded completely. Then I turned out the final light and went to bed, the house warm around me, mine in every possible way that mattered. The morning after everything settled, the papers signed, the house silent again, I woke to the sound of birds I hadn't heard in months. It was a soft chorus that came through the open window, blending with the faint hum of traffic in the distance. a reminder that the world still went on with its ordinary indifference. I lay there for a while, watching the light move slowly across the ceiling, feeling the unfamiliar weight of peace. It wasn't the triumphal peace of victory, but something quieter, earned, the kind that arrives only after every word has been spoken, and there's no longer a need to defend yourself. The air smelled faintly of rain and coffee grounds from the kitchen. I got up, wrapped Derek's old robe around me, and padded down the hallway, my feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Each step felt new, as though I were walking through the same house but inside a different lifetime. The house itself seemed changed, though I knew it was really me. It no longer felt like a battlefield or a relic waiting to be catalogued. It was simply a home again, with its imperfect floors and stubborn doors that creaked when the weather turned. I noticed details I hadn't allowed myself to see when I was defending it. The gentle curve in the banister Derek sanded by hand, the uneven paint on the kitchen cabinets where Daniel, as a boy, had tried to help and left streaks I'd never bothered to fix. All of it was suddenly precious in a way that had nothing to do with nostalgia. It was proof of life, evidence of time lived without permission. The following week, I began making small changes, not to modernize, but to renew. I scrubbed the windows until the glass was clear again, moved the furniture back to where it belonged, and brought down the boxes Lisa had shoved into corners. I unpacked them slowly, carefully, as though restoring a museum collection that no one but me would ever understand. There were letters from Derek, old recipes written in my mother's hand, a few photographs I hadn't seen in years, Daniel as a toddler with cake smeared across his cheeks, me at 32, hair windblown, holding him against my hip on the front porch. The woman in that picture looked impossibly young, but I could still feel her somewhere beneath the lines and years. I pinned the photo to the refrigerator with a small magnet shaped like a sunflower. It was the first thing I saw every morning afterward. The neighbors began to come by more often once the gossip faded into admiration. Mrs. Kane visited almost daily, sometimes with pie, sometimes just with stories. "You know," she said once, stirring sugar into her tea, "people keep saying you were brave, but I think you were just sensible. You knew what was yours." I smiled at that. Sensible. That word felt closer to the truth than brave. Bravery always implies you have a choice to walk away. I never did. The house and I were bound by something older than ownership. It wasn't long before the trust sent a representative, a young woman named Elise, maybe 30 at most, polite but nervous, as if stepping into someone else's memory. She carried a briefcase and wore a blue scarf that looked too bright for such an old room. "Mrs. Hale," she said, shaking my hand with both of hers, "I wanted to introduce myself personally. I'll be the contact for the program moving forward. Once you're ready, we'll begin the renovations for the downstairs quarters." I led her through the rooms, explaining the history of each one, the small imperfections that shouldn't be touched. She listened carefully, taking notes. When we reached the back porch, she looked out at the garden and smiled. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "I think the women who come will feel safe." I nodded, feeling something warm unfurl in my chest. "That's the point," I told her. "Safety that doesn't feel borrowed." After she left, I walked through the garden alone. The roses had gone dormant for the season, their stems bare but strong. The oak tree stood silent, its branches etched against the pale sky. I realized that everything living knows when to hold on and when to rest. It doesn't need to be told. I sat on the bench beneath the tree, the one Derek had built from leftover wood, and watched the last of the leaves drift to the ground. There was no sadness in it, just completion. Weeks passed quietly. Daniel didn't call for a while, and I didn't expect him to. I knew that silence was his way of processing, of retreating from the sting of being refused. When he finally did appear, it was unannounced, as if he had been standing outside, rehearsing his apology. He looked tired, older than I remembered, and there was no anger left in his eyes. "I came to see how you're doing," he said. I poured him coffee, and we sat in the kitchen without saying much. After a long while, he asked, "You really won't change your mind?" "No," I said gently. "It's done. But you're welcome to come for dinner whenever you like." He nodded, studying the rim of his cup. "Lisa won't understand," he said finally. "Then don't explain it to her," I replied. "Let her think what she wants." When he left, he hugged me longer than he had in years. That was enough. As winter deepened, the first woman arrived through the Trust's program. A widow named Celia, small and quiet, with a face that carried the same weariness I'd once seen in my own mirror. She stayed in the refurbished guest room downstairs, the one Lisa had once called the blue room. It was still blue, but now the color felt like water instead of ice. She kept mostly to herself at first, but after a few days she joined me in the kitchen, helping with dinner, humming while she peeled potatoes. We didn't talk much, but there was comfort in her presence, a rhythm forming between us like the steady pulse of something living. Over time, more women came, each with her own story, her own silence, her own small act of survival. The house filled with voices again, not loud ones, but steady, grounded ones that belonged there. It no longer felt like I was defending my past. I was sharing it. One evening, I sat with Celia and another woman, Nora, at the dining table. The air smelled of baked bread and lemon polish. They were laughing about something, a memory of burnt toast, I think, and for a moment, I closed my eyes just to listen. The sound was soft and human, without expectation. I thought of Lisa's words from so long ago. "Your mom's house is wasted on her." I smiled at the irony. The house was anything but wasted now. It had become exactly what it was always meant to be, a place where women could exist without apology. That night, as I climbed the stairs to my room, I paused halfway and looked down at the light glowing from the kitchen. The voices were fading, replaced by the familiar creak of the floorboards settling into evening. I touched the banister, feeling the smoothness worn by years of hands. Derek's, Daniel's, mine, now others too. The house had become a chorus of all of us. I understood then that I had not given it away. I had multiplied it. In bed, with the window open just enough to let in the cold, I listened to the night sounds, the steady hum of the world, the faint echo of laughter drifting up from downstairs, the soft tap of a branch against the glass. I thought about how small acts of defiance often look like stillness from the outside, how choosing to stay can sometimes be the loudest thing a person can do. Before I drifted to sleep, I whispered a kind of blessing into the dark, not for myself, but for whoever would one day wake in this room after me. May you know what it means to belong to yourself before anyone tries to tell you otherwise. The house seemed to breathe in reply, its walls holding the warmth of every life it had sheltered, and in that quiet, unbroken moment, I finally felt home.